Liferay. How you folks all doing out there? You all right? You can say you're all right, it's fine. And hello to all the folks watching on the stream. And my name's Dylan Beattie. And I have a question for all you folks. How many of you have ever had like a second-hand car, like a used car? Yeah? I have, yeah. How many of you ever bought like a second-hand musical instrument, like a guitar, a violin? Maybe you got some vintage clothing, like you got that really great leather jacket that you found in a flea market that, it used to belong to someone else, but it still has value, and so you bought it, and now you got it and you love it. How many of you own any second-hand software? I don't see any hands. I mean, so Brian has some. Now, when you talk about second-hand software these days, you think about this. You think about going on eBay and looking for, boxed copies of stuff, which is interesting because it has historical value. It's a relic. It's an interesting artifact from history. The whole idea that you would buy a piece of software and use it until you didn't need it anymore, and then you could sell it to somebody else and get some of your money back, that doesn't happen anymore. That's just a thing that almost never happens. Now, it still does in one very specific niche. And that niche is console gaming. Because it's all to do with distribution channels. Console games have always been, since the days of Nintendo and Sega and right through to Xbox and PlayStation, the distribution network for console gaming is a piece of plastic with a game burned into it. But the code is so tightly coupled to the distribution mechanism that it is almost, we have emulation, we have reverse engineering, people have got gadgets to fix this stuff. But generally speaking, when it comes to console gaming, the game is the piece of plastic. And the piece of plastic is the game. And you buy the game, you play the game till you're finished, and then you go and sell the game to somebody else. Now, when I was a kid, I grew up first in Africa, but then I moved to the UK when I was 10 years old. So my teenage years, I was at school in Bristol, in the western part of England, and there were two kinds of kids at my school. There were the computer kids and the console kids. And the computer kids, we had long hair, we rode mountain bikes. The console kids, they had the kind of close-cropped shaved heads, and they rode skateboards, and they were always getting in trouble for setting stuff on fire. And we also set stuff on fire, but we tended not to get caught. And the computer kids, when it came to video games, we had the PC, and we had the Amiga, we had the Atari ST. And if we wanted to play a new game, we had a choice. Option one is we could go out and buy one. Now, we're talking games like, X-Wing and Eye of the Beholder and A Secret of Monkey Island. These cost about £20 if I went into a store. Now, to put that in perspective, I'm a teenager with no money. £20 is a new pair of jeans. £20 is 20 Big Macs. Like, £20 is a significant part of my allowance. And so it had to be a really good game to justify actually paying for it. And so the other thing that you could do is you could phone up your friend Steve and say, Steve, have you got Monkey Island? Can I copy Monkey Island off you? Now, I'm not saying that they knew this was going on, but Monkey Island literally came with a thing called Dial a Pirate in the box that you were supposed to use to prove that you'd actually paid for the game. We figured out how to copy this. It was just made of cardboard. You took it apart and you copied it and put it back together. Games were uncopyable. They had hidden sectors that the firmware could see, but the operating system's disk copy couldn't. We figured out ways to get around it. There is no copy protection system that will beat bored teenagers with no money. There really isn't. So we had the games we bought, we had the games we copied, but there was a third option. If you bought the computer magazines, there were these classified advertisements in the back for free software. And you had to pay money for it, but it was free. And this kind of made sense, because what they were, this was a whole bunch of different models. There was public domain software, where somebody wrote it and went, you know what, just put it in the world. I don't care. I don't want it. Sometimes they wouldn't even put their name and address, no contact details. It was just, this code is free. And companies would take that code, they'd put it on a disk, and you'd pay them $3 and they'd send you the disk. Some of it was demos. Some of it was trialware. Some of it was weird things, like the Ford Motor Company made a computer game called the Ford Simulator, which was free because they thought that you would play this on your IBM PC in 4-color CGA and go, yeah, I want to buy that car. I don't know if it ever sold any cars, but we certainly played a lot of Ford Simulator. But Perhaps the most successful distribution model that was based on this idea of buying disks with free software on it was popularized by this guy. This is Scott Miller. He founded a company called Apogee Software. And Scott had created a game for the IBM PC that was called Kingdom of Kroz. And Kingdom of Kroz was so big, it wouldn't fit on one floppy disk. It was that vast. It was like Baldur's Gate 3, only in like 1989 or something. And so what he did was he thought, all right, well, I'll split the game into 3 parts. And I'll put part 1, and I'll say, part 1, you can copy that. It's free. You can share it with your friends. You can sell it in your magazines. You can swap it in the schoolyard. You do whatever you want. But then when you got to the end of part 1, little screen pops up saying, hey, if you enjoyed that, send a check to this address, which was his parents' house in Texas, and I'll send you part 2 and 3 on disk. This worked. Kingdom of Kroz made nearly $100,000 in a couple of months and was so successful that it bootstrapped a whole new publishing model for software. Now, a little while after this, Scott Miller got hold of a demo of Dangerous Dave, written by a group of developers working down in Louisiana at a company called SoftDisk. John Romero, John Carmack, and Tom Hall. And they called their group, it was called Ideas from the Deep, and then it was called ID, and then it was just called id. And they had figured out a way to do smooth, side-scrolling graphics on the IBM PC. No one had ever really done this before. This was a console thing. Carmack and Romero figured out how to do it on the PC. And just to show off what they did, they ported Super Mario to the IBM PC compatible. And then they sent a disk to Nintendo and said, would you be interested in publishing Mario for the PC? And Nintendo said, this is very impressive work, gentlemen. Bury it. We never, ever, ever want to see Super Mario running on an IBM PC because Nintendo wanted to sell plastic. They didn't want kids swapping copies of Mario in the schoolyard because that would eat into their revenue stream. So Scott Miller gets wind of this, gets in touch with the folks from id, and he says, hey, I love the technology, I love the game. We're not going to do Super Mario. Why don't you develop your own original game, and you can put that out on my shareware platform. We'll split it into 3 parts. Part 1 is free, and part 2 and 3, then that's the parts that people send in a check, and we'll send them the discs. And that game was Commander Keen. Invasion of the Vorticons, where you play an 8-year-old genius with a pogo stick and a football helmet who has to go to Mars and recover all the stolen parts of your spaceship. This made $30,000 in 2 weeks. It was enough money that the folks from id, they quit their jobs at SoftDisk and they started developing games full-time, and they went on to develop some of the most influential games in history. Wolfenstein 3D, June 1992. This was the first kind of 3D first-person. It was the first game where instead of just kind of turning 90 degrees at a time, you could actually run around corners. You couldn't look up and down, but, baby steps. And then Doom came out. And Doom added steps. You could go up and down. Doom added network deathmatch. Doom crashed every college network in America because of all these kids downloading it and going, this is fantastic. Pioneered the whole concept of multiplayer LAN, deathmatch-style network gaming. And then Quake was, it wasn't the first fully 3D first-person shooter, and it wasn't the first game to use video accelerator cards, but it was definitely one of the earliest and certainly the highest profile. It's the game that popularized immersive, networked video, hardware-accelerated, full 3D immersive environments. Now, these games all used the same Apogee model. Episode 1 was free, and then if you wanted to, you could pay money and get episode 2 and 3. But the way that you got hold of each episode, that varied. And it's not just that it varied. It's that it represented a paradigm shift in the way software was distributed. I got Wolfenstein 3D on a floppy disk, so I couldn't use it in my iMac, but hey, I didn't have an iMac, on the cover of PC Format magazine. I copied Doom from a friend of mine at college, and then Quake, I downloaded from this new thing called the World Wide Web that had just kind of been invented. And the lovely thing, if you look at the small print, you could download Quake as 7 separate files so you could put it on floppy disks to take it home. Because lots of people in 1997, they had the internet at college or at university or maybe at work, but they didn't have it in their house yet. And so this was some, forward thinking. Now, this time around 96, 97, the whole world is getting connected. The internet's been around for a couple of decades. The web has been around for 4 or 5 years. But this was the point in history where people started getting a dial-up modem at home. People started getting online. People started getting email. And When we did, we discovered that there was an online community, a thriving community of developers and evangelists who had some very specific ideas about what free software meant that had nothing to do with getting it on the cover of a magazine. This was the GNU project, founded in the early 1980s at MIT by a guy called Richard Stallman, with the aim of creating a completely free replacement for the Unix operating system. And to the GNU project, free was about the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program however you want for any purpose. Once you've got the code, you can do anything you like with it. Nobody can tell you what you can and cannot do with it. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study how the program works and modify it to do what you want. And that means you need the source code. That means you don't just get the binaries, you need to be able to take the thing apart and modify it, get it to do whatever you want it to do. Freedom 2, because we count from 0, the freedom to distribute copies. And freedom 3 is the freedom to share your own modifications. Now, the interesting caveat is it doesn't say anything in here about free software having to be free. It has to be unrestricted. It's free in the sense of free speech. Doesn't say anything about it not having to cost money. Stallman and the rest of the GNU project, they perhaps naively believed that you could make a living from selling free software. And there's a lot of folks in this room today who are like, yeah, we do make a living from selling free software. So in some sense, they were right. They were really onto something. But these freedoms were the founding philosophies of the GNU project, set up in 1983. Now, by 1991, they nearly had a complete operating system. They had a compiler, they had a linker, they had an editor, they had all this kind of stuff. They just didn't have a kernel, which is kind of like saying, yeah, I've almost finished inventing a car. I got a stereo, and I got a steering wheel, and I got the wing mirrors. I don't have an engine yet, but that's all right. But maybe more significantly, along the way, they had created something called the GNU General Public License, an attempt at a legally binding document that codified those 4 freedoms in law that anybody could use to publish their software under a license that would guarantee and safeguard those freedoms for as long as that software existed. 1991, Linus Torvalds, who was a student at the University of Helsinki, announced on Usenet that he was working on a free operating system. It's just a hobby. It won't be big and professional like GNU, and it would only run on 386 and 486 PCs. And there's a lovely note. He says it'll only support 80 hard drives because that's the only hard drives that I have. But fundamentally, it had a working operating system kernel that was compatible with the GNU toolchain, and he uploaded the source code for it to the university's FTP server. By December, the combination of Linus's Linux kernel and the GNU operating systems tools was self-bootstrapping. You could use a GNU Linux system to build GNU and build Linux. So for the first time in history, we had a complete free working operating system which was distributed under a license agreement which guaranteed its users the freedom to run it, modify it, share it, and even sell it as long as they didn't impose any restrictions on their customers. Now, this is a really interesting point in history, 97, 98. This is around the time I started doing software and technology professionally. And lots of companies were like, we need a website. And this was interesting. I was a webmaster. Any of you folks ever have that job title way back in the day? Because corporate IT didn't want to touch the web because the web was this weird thing for hippies. So they'd be like, you can do web. We're going to still do all the important computer stuff. You can do web. And so you'd be like, right, I've got a little bit of a budget, and I taught myself HTML with an O'Reilly book that I bought. I need a web server. And I don't know if any of you folks ever tried hosting web servers on Windows 95. It was terrible. But there was this amazing software out there. There was fantastic, enterprise quality, free software published under the GNU General Public License. And so a bunch of companies saw an opportunity. Companies like Red Hat went, well, there's this software out there which is free, but you need to know how to use it. You need to know how to download it, how to set up a makefile, configure it, compile it for your architecture, run it, support it, troubleshoot it, all this kind of stuff. Companies don't want that. Companies want to get software in a box with a phone number on the back, and you install the software in the box, and if it doesn't work, you call the phone number, because that's how you sold enterprise software. And so they thought, well, we got an opportunity. There's nothing says we can't sell the GNU software for money. Let's do it. Free software, only $79.99. And of course, a bunch of companies are like, sorry, what? How is it free and it's $80? It says it's free. Now, the term open source, at this point in history, no one had ever used the phrase open source yet. It hadn't been discussed. And it was this lady, Christine Peterson, who was the founder of a research place in San Francisco called the Foresight Institute, was involved in a lot of these early meetings with the people who would end up pioneering the open source movement. And as she describes it, those new to the term free software assume it's referring to price. Old-timers must then launch into an explanation, which is usually given as follows: we mean free as in freedom, not free as in beer. And at this point, the discussion on software has turned into one about the price of an alcoholic beverage. Between meetings that week, I was still focused on the need for a better name, and I came up with the term open source software. It's actually, if you read her diaries of the time she's doing it, she came up with this idea, but didn't kind of go into the meeting and go, hey, everyone, I've got a great idea. She just started calling it that. And by the end of the day, the other people in the meetings were also talking about open source, and she's like, yeah, this is going to work. This is going to catch on. There was a massive, the Free Software Summit became the Open Source Summit. The first opensource.org was set up within a couple of weeks by Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens, and this phrase open source got kind of pushed out into the limelight. And it represented a new way of doing business with free software, where the code was still open. The code was unrestricted, but you could sell it and you could add support, you could add bundling, you could add verification and regressions and all the other kind of things that corporate customers wanted, built on top of code that was still free as in beer, free as in speech, free as in unrestricted. Now, this started highlighting some concerns because a lot of companies started looking at this stuff. And they noticed this in the GNU General Public License, this very specific clause here: you may not impose any further restrictions on the recipient's exercise of the rights granted herein. The GPL is sometimes referred to as a viral license. If I get some GPL software and I extend it or modify it to create a product, and then I give you the binaries for that product, I have to give you the source, and I have to give you the freedom to put the source on the internet, to share the source, to copy the source, to modify the source, do any of these kinds of things. This is why it's known as a viral license. And the way that the GPL operates on this is actually through the mechanism of copyright, which I've always thought is kind of clever. If you contribute code to a GPL project, you're not giving away your rights. You still own the code. A lot of other projects use something called a contributor license agreement, which we'll come back to. Now, this idea of this viral license which perpetuates the freedoms, this got a little bit of bad press because of this guy, who will have been wrong twice in the first hour of Liferay Devcon today. So hot on the heels, this is just before going out and saying no one would ever buy iPhone because it didn't have a keyboard. This is Steve Ballmer saying Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That's the way that the license works. Ballmer is wrong. That's not how Linux works. It's not how the license works. Cancer is not contagious, Steve. That's not how any of this works. But he's the CEO of Microsoft. And this quote gets airtime all over the world. Microsoft says Linux is cancer. And all the companies who are Microsoft customers are like, oh, wow, Linux is cancer. We better not touch that, you know. Now, it's fair to say this is kind of the turn of the millennium. Microsoft believe the future is about selling desktop software. Windows, Office, SQL Server, Exchange. Computing belongs on the business desktop. The desktop belongs to Microsoft. Anything that threatens that status quo is an existential threat to Microsoft's existence. That's changed. And the thing that changed it is one word: it's cloud. Because cloud unlocked a new way of paying for software, a new revenue stream. Yeah, have the code. Code is free. Oh, you're going to need somewhere to run that. Now, in the process, cloud enabled economies of scale we'd never seen before. Forget about setting up servers. Forget about building racks. Just have a factory that turns out shipping containers full of compute. And then you put as many shipping containers as you need. And when the servers start to fail, you don't care. And when one of those shipping containers is like 20% dead, you just pull the whole thing out and fly in another shipping container. Now, early in my career, when my job title was webmaster, one of the things I did was I built servers. And I'd order a server from Dell. It would take 6, maybe 8 weeks to arrive. I'd get a friend to help me pick it up and put it in the rack, and then I'd put on Linux, I'd put on Apache and MySQL, all this kind of stuff. And, I got paid for it. I charged maybe £1,000 for a new server and a couple of £100 a month for support and maintenance. And they were snowflakes, because no two servers were exactly alike. They'd all be a little bit different versions, different configuration. If I got 20 people phone me up in the morning and say, hey, can I have a MySQL server by the end of the day? In theory, I've just had a £20,000 payday. In practice, I have to say no, because I cannot do that. I cannot do it fast enough. The cloud fixed that. The cloud just scaled everything up by a factor of 1,000. And before you know it, you've got big companies out there that are raking in millions, tens of millions of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever currency you care to employ. In foreigns, that's going to be like tens of thousands of hundreds of millions, right? For free software that they're running, like MySQL's free, Linux is free, Apache is free, put them all on a server, suddenly you're making 10 million euros a month. Let's meet Sammy the squirrel. Sammy lives in a forest among all the other little happy woodland creatures, and they have a thing in the forest. They have Sunday show and tell. Every Sunday, all the little animals, they come down to the clearing with the old tree stump, and they show each other what they've been working on, and they share their crafting projects. And Sammy loves writing video games. And one week, Sammy turns up and shows the rest of the animals, hey, check this out. It's Acorn Adventure. It's a little game where you run around the forest and you're a curious little squirrel and you've got to gather enough acorns for the winter and try not to get bothered by the owl. And it's just lovely stuff. And Sammy's given the game away for free because Sammy's a nice little squirrel and hoping that the other woodland folk will take it. And maybe they'll add their own characters or build their own levels or their own content. And next week, when Sammy arrives in the clearing for show and tell, they notice that Jeff the raccoon has got there early because Jeff has brought an arcade machine and set it up in one side of the glade. And this is awesome. Like, Sammy's game is running on a proper cabinet with a joystick and buttons and everything, and it's only 50 cents a game. And all the little woodland animals are queuing up and they're pestering their parents for more money so that they can have another go. And the game is really good, and everyone is having a great time with it. Next week, Jeff turns up in a shiny, brand new pickup truck with 2 arcade machines. And the woodland folk, they just can't get enough of Acorn Adventure. They think this is fantastic, but they're starting to get, they're like, oh, this game is too hard. They're like, the owl is too difficult. The graphics on level 2, the graphics aren't good enough. And Sammy tries very patiently to explain that Acorn Adventure is free. It's free software. If they want to fix it, they can fix it. They can change the difficulty. They can add new graphics. But of course, to the rest of the animals, it's not free. They're paying 50 cents. They're paying customers, and they think they're entitled to a high-quality product. And in the meantime, Sammy has been so busy trying to keep them all happy that Sammy hasn't had time to gather any real acorns for the winter. And with the cost of living crisis and everything, Sammy is thinking, maybe it would be nice if I could make just a little bit of money out of this game, perhaps. Next week, Jeff the raccoon shows up in a solid gold helicopter. But Sammy's not bothered by this because Sammy has just finished Acorn Adventure 2, the sequel. Better graphics, better music, more levels, better gameplay. It's easier to defeat the owl. And there's a new rule. It's still free. You can still take it home. You can still study it and share it in school and make your own modifications. But if you want to install Acorn Adventure on a pay-to-play arcade machine, you have to give Sammy $1. Oh boy, the woodland animals did not like that. It all kicked off, screeching, howling, pelting them with fruit, saying Sammy's a traitor, Sammy is a seller, Sammy's done a rug pull. One of them got so angry they took Acorn Adventure 1.0 and they forked it and they said, this will always be free. It's called Open These Nuts. How did we get here? How did Sammy get to a point where Sammy created this wonderful game that everyone loves and gave it away for free and then said, you know what, if there's money on the table, I'd like a little bit of it just so I can afford to feed my family. And now everyone hates them for it. Within the last couple of years, we've seen a bunch of projects, high-profile projects, switch from permissive licenses to some sort of dual licensing model. MongoDB has done this. ImageSharp is a .NET image processing library. They've done this. Docker, Terraform, Unity, Redis. Redis is I'm sure you folks know, it's an in-memory cache database. It's blisteringly fast. It's written in C. It's been around for 15 years. Until March this year, Redis was published under a thing called the BSD license, the Berkeley Systems Distribution License, which is a permissive license. Take the software, do whatever you want. We don't care. You just can't pretend that you invented it. Now, in March this year, Redis announced they were switching their licenses. Future versions are not going to be BSD anymore. They went so far as to explicitly state that cloud service providers who provide hosted Redis will no longer be permitted to use the source code free of charge. So it's free as in beer, but it's not free as in speech anymore. And sure enough, the Woodland folk rioted. A bunch of people, some of them forked the last BSD version of Redis. There's now a new project called Valkey. Microsoft have a protocol-compatible replacement called Garnet, which they're deploying on Azure for folks who want to migrate away from the Redis code base. Now, I have no idea what the future looks like for projects like Redis and Terraform. I suspect that what will happen is that the open source forks will do well for a couple of years, but then they're going to get the same problems. More people use them means you have more requests, more demands, more support. And unless you have some kind of model to sustain the effort involved in managing those, it's not going to work. But we don't need to predict the future because we can learn from the past. This is Service Stack. Service Stack was and is a .NET library and framework for building responsive APIs and message building applications. And in 2013, Service Stack switched licenses. It went from being MIT license, completely free, do whatever you want with it, to a dual licensing model, which is basically it's completely free unless you're making any money. And if you are, then you have to pay a developer fee per license. Now, this upset a lot of people. At the time, I was one of them. I used Service Stack, my team used Service Stack, and when they brought out the new licensing fee, I kind of had to go to my boss and say, look, there's this thing we've been using that used to be free, but now it's going to be like $8,000 per developer per year. And my boss said, what is it? And I said, it's a thing we use to build APIs. And the boss said, what's an API? Do we sell those? And I was like, I'm not going to win this argument. And so, we migrated. For us, that particular niche didn't generate enough revenue. But earlier this year, I pinged a developer, Demis Bellot, and I said, hey, I'm doing this talk about open source. It's been 10 years since you did the license switch. How's it all going? And I got this great response from him. He said, I've been able to work full-time on Service Stack since I left Stack Exchange. So he quit his job at Stack Exchange to go and do this full-time. Service Stack software is greatly improved, much more capable. I was willing to take a pay cut, so I was really surprised when I ended up making more money off doing this. And it's allowed our family to be financially independent and given me the freedom to work on whichever features I want. Now, financial independence, work on anything you like. Sounds like a pretty good deal, right? Yeah. Service Stack's doing great. Service Stack has gone from strength to strength. It's on version 8. They keep on shipping new features. Now, there was an open source fork, like Valkey and all the other, OpenTofu, open source fork called NServiceKit. That's dead. It was interesting for 18 months. By 2015, no one was committed to it anymore. The GitHub repository for that project now looks like a graveyard. So the question that we got to ask is, I just want to check the time. There is a countdown timer here that says I got 3 minutes, and the agenda says I got 9 minutes. Can we get a steward's inquiry? So the question is, the folks out there who write code and they share code, why do they do it? Because there is this idea, like, I'm going to do open source, and then one day that's going to pay my bills. And there's a lot of folks out there who get paid. There's probably folks in the room who your job is to write code that is then published under open source license. There are a lot of folks working at Microsoft, Amazon, Google, who do open source for a job. And they get a salary, and they get their benefits, but the output of what they do is then published under an open license. There are a lot of folks out there who are like, I'm going to share code, I'm going to have fun, I'm not doing it for the money, which is great up until you accidentally create something important, and then the rest of the world starts filing bugs and saying there are security issues that are your problem. But there's also a lot of Sammy squirrels out there, developers who've created a library or a module or a framework or something which has become incredibly popular, to the extent that folks out there in the world, they're making loads of money off this, and those developers are, wondering how they're going to get enough acorns for the winter. And I have absolutely no doubt that in a perfect world where no one was worried about billing and accounting and everything, everybody out there would be creating really, really good software. And all the users would be happy. It would be secure. It would be fast. It would be lean and agile, all these other lovely words that we talk about. But that's not how the real world works. We have only so many hours in the day. We've only got so many keystrokes left in our fingers. We need to make sure that we are prioritizing solving problems that haven't been solved yet. And what we have discovered time after time after time is that if you have already created something and you have given it away for free, it can be incredibly difficult to turn around later and say, actually, it's not going to be free anymore. People do not like that. Now, I'm going to share this, just something I want all of you to think about and I want you to take away, because it's probably the single most important message in this entire talk. People who share their source code do not owe you anything. Any of you folks out there who have built a product or a platform or a business on top of open source software, what you've got is the source code. And in some cases, maybe you don't even have the source code because you're just using the binaries. Because, deep down, you know that you can get the code. And if you need to fix a bug and no one else will do it for you, then at least you're going to be able to do that. If I share my code with you, what I'm giving you is saying, here is some code, and I'm not going to turn around tomorrow and say, you can't run this code. I might turn around and say, you can't run the next version. I might turn around and say, you can't get to my plugin repository anymore. You can't get to my platform as a service. You can't have cloud hosting. I might even turn around tomorrow and say, I've deleted all the GitHub projects, and I've wiped the repository, and the website is gone, and I'm going to go and live on a farm. I hope you got a snapshot of the source code before all that happened, because otherwise you're going to be in trouble. But fundamentally, that's all you get. But that's still pretty amazing. I spend a lot of time working with Adobe. And Adobe are like the devil when it comes to software licensing, because you don't own anything. You have to pay. Every month, I pay $50 to get Adobe Creative Cloud. And I have to pay that. If I stop paying that, I can't use the programs. If I can't use the programs, I can't open my own work. I've got like a decade's worth of video projects and Photoshop and Illustrator and all this kind of stuff, and I just kind of accept it, and I suck it up and I pay the tax. If Adobe turn around tomorrow and say, yeah, you know what, inflation, it's $100 a month. If they turn around and say $500 a month, I'm like, maybe I should look at alternatives. If Adobe turn around and go, oops, we accidentally broke our authentication server, sorry, I can't open Photoshop today, or tomorrow, or until they fix it. And if Adobe goes bankrupt, I have no idea what happens to anybody. It's one of the reasons I keep giving them $50, because I don't want that to happen. Now, you talk to a certain kind of audience about things like, Adobe Photoshop and Premiere and Illustrator, and they'll be like, oh, that's your fault. You should be using open source alternatives. And there's a piece of software called After Effects, which is part of the Creative Cloud Suite, which is video post-production for doing graphics and movie special effects and visuals and all this kind of stuff. There is nothing like it. And I say to people, what should I be using instead of Adobe After Effects? And the stock answer you always get is I should use Blender and the GIMP. Blender and the GIMP is not a replacement for After Effects. It's a bad 70s cop show that never got made. Blender is brilliant for 3D modeling. It does not replace that software. The GIMP is, it's out there. It's still got this daft name, which makes it really hard to use for your job. You ever go to your boss and I don't want to Photoshop, I'm going to use a GIMP. The boss is like, you're going to do what? Now, I love the fact that the Free Software Foundation exists and the GNU public license exists, or the general public license exists, and that something as powerful as Linux exists in the world under a license that means nobody is ever going to take that away. And it seems to me like this open source model, it worked incredibly well for quite a long time because, money was cheap. It was easy to borrow money. It was relatively easy to hire developers. Last couple of years, the world has changed dramatically, and the free money's kind of gone away. And a lot of people are really looking at money as part of the whole software equation in a way they haven't for a long time. And that's, CEOs looking at profit forecasts, or it's single developers looking at the price of their electric bill and the groceries in the store and going, maybe we're not doing this quite right. Now, I want to wrap up today by giving you all something to think about, something to chew on. How many of you have ever worked at a big company and you've tried to get them? Now, I realize this may be the wrong audience for this question because Liferay seems to do this very well. But you ever try to get your employer to sponsor an open source project or pay for it? You go to the boss, you're like, hey, we're using this library. I think we should give them some money. And the boss is like, why? We already have the code. Why would we give them money? This is hard. Getting multinational corporations to open their wallets is incredibly difficult. But any of you folks out there who host on Azure or Google Cloud or AWS, you get a bill every month with a number at the end of it. Would you notice if that number went up by 10? 100? 500? 1,000? You know, I talk to companies who their cloud bill is 6 figures a month, and they're like, yeah, we don't itemize it, we just pay it. If we could get a little bit of money onto that bill every month and filter that back out, the way to build a successful business isn't to send a lot of tiny invoices. It's to hit Microsoft, Amazon, and Google with $750,000 once a month and then distribute it. Because then you've only got to send 3 invoices. So, and obviously we need to give them all the metadata and everything so they can pass those costs on to their enterprise cloud customers. But if we could unlock a revenue stream flowing back into open source somehow. Now, you folks are familiar with Spotify, right? I'd be paying Spotify $15 a month for 10 years now. You know how much music I own? None. I don't own anything. Spotify is convenience. Spotify is, I want to listen to Taylor Swift right now, and I don't want to go to a store, and I don't want to download it. I just want to click the button, and I want it to happen. And the cloud is Spotify for enterprise. The cloud is Spotify for business. They want the Taylor Swift album. They need a 64-core PostgreSQL cluster right now. Click, 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 click. There it is. Bang. Pay for it. When you're finished, you can't sell it. You know, there's no second-hand cloud databases. You just shut it down and stop paying for it. But that convenience, corporations love it. Big companies love it. Platforms absolutely love it. Now, let's imagine, I'm going to use NuGet as the example here. This is the package management ecosystem that exists in the .NET space. There are similar things. Java is Maven, right? And Ruby has the kind of GEMS ecosystem, and Node has NPM. But all of the mainstream development ecosystems have a package manager. And NuGet publishes statistics on how many packages get downloaded. And so what I did is I crunched some numbers. I'm like, let's imagine we're going to take the most downloaded packages on NuGet, we'll extrapolate to get the total number of users and the total number of downloads, and then I'm going to do some Bart Simpson arithmetic. And we're going to say, all right, well, let's say we've got 53 billion and something, so that's every 6 weeks, roughly 40 billion downloads a month. And then alongside that, we got 2.4 million active users. Now, business plan, let's say half the people using our system are using it for free. We got this many on the basic plan, that's $15 a month. We got the indie plan, that's 75, and then the big companies, we're going to hit them with 500 a month. $43 million, that's our revenue pot. Now we take that, we multiply that by that, and we get $0.001 US per download, which is an insultingly small amount of money. Even Spotify pays more than that. But from where open source is right now, that is a massive step in the right direction. The most popular packages in the .NET ecosystem, this brings in about $13,000 a month. That's kind of quit your job, hire an assistant, fix the bug, support the thing, close the security hole money. The middle of the road, $3,000. Now, you're not going to quit your job for that, but well, I don't know, some people might, depends how much your rent is. But that's enough to justify, hey, I'm going to do 4-day weeks for a while I finish version 2. Or, you know, buying new hardware, new hosting, new laptop stuff. And then right down the bottom, things like NAudio, which is an audio processing library. We're talking maybe $120 a month for that. It's not much, but it's a new laptop every couple of years. You know, it's bringing something back in. But all we're doing here is we're paying for convenience. The folks who subscribe to NuGet Premium or Maven Premium, they don't own the software. We're doing what Red Hat did. We're doing what Slackware did. We're putting free software on a channel that makes it easier for people to get it in a format that is easy for them to consume. Now, this is never going to happen because the Woodland folk would riot if we turned around for any of these existing package management repositories and said it costs money now. But something is happening in the state of software over the next few years, which I think is potentially very interesting and potentially an opportunity to do this differently. And that's this, WASI, the WebAssembly System Interface. WebAssembly is a big deal. WebAssembly is in browsers. We now have WebAssembly on servers, which is software eating its own tail again and again and again. But what it means is we've got a new binary runtime. You write your project in whatever language you want, Go, Rust, C#, Java, whatever. And all of these languages, if they don't have it already, they're figuring out how do we compile this to WebAssembly. And if we need to port our entire runtime, so we got a JVM on WebAssembly with our program on WebAssembly, they're figuring out how to do that, which means we have a systems interface that, say you need a library for compressing PNG images. We don't need one for Java and one for .NET and one for C anymore. We just got one. And it doesn't matter what it's written in, because you can consume that package from any one of those ecosystems if you're targeting WebAssembly, which means we're going to end up with a massive package repository of WASI libraries for doing one thing well. And maybe before we get all excited and say, hey, let's give the software away for free, and then 5 years later we're like, I have no money and that person has a solid gold helicopter, what went wrong? Maybe this is an opportunity to try something different in a way that is being spearheaded by a fundamental change in the distribution ecosystem. Open source is 25 years old. We have done free as in beer, and it's awesome, and there are literally millions of people all over the world making websites and building apps and writing code and creating art and connecting with each other, and they didn't have to pay money for the privilege of doing it. But maybe if you're making $1 million a year, you should be sharing some of that with the people who helped you get there. We've done free as in speech. And that's great. There is a free, open operating system that no one can take away. There is this growing body of legal precedent saying the GPL is actually valid, but that freedom comes at a cost. There are security vulnerabilities, there is peer pressure, there is online bullying. There are just people under a massive amount of stress as a result of the contribution they made. So I want you all to think about a third kind of freedom. And it's not free as in beer, and it's not free as in speech. It's free as in waking up on Saturday and going, I actually get the weekend off. I'm not going to get WhatsApp messages. The site is not going to go down. I'm not worried about having enough money coming in for feeding my family. The software is secure. The revenue is sustainable. The model makes sense. This is all going to be okay. It's not free as in speech, and it's not free as in beer. It's what I call free as in weekend. Thank you very much.